Good evening, everybody. How are you? I'm Carter Sneed. I'm the director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm also a professor of law here at the University of Notre Dame. And we're delighted to welcome you all to tonight's lecture, The Critic's Critic, G.K. Chesterton on God and Literature. Through the DeNicola Center's Student Formation Program, the Soren Fellows Program, we seek to allow students to engage contemporary and enduring figures in the Catholic moral and intellectual traditions across both a wide range of disciplines and mediums. Through the program's biannual Salon series, students are put into direct engagement with seminal thinkers and texts that form and inform the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition. Past authors featured through this series have included Catholics such as Flannery O'Connor and Christians of other faith denominations, including C.S. Lewis and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, all of whom, whether through fiction, nonfiction, autobiography, and the like, reflect, clarify, and address perennial intellectual ideas and human conditions that affect the Catholic imagination. It's hard to imagine a speaker and thinker and author of the 20th century that looms larger in every sense, but especially in the genre of Western literature, than G.K. Chesterton. And it's difficult to imagine anyone who can speak with more authority on him than our speaker tonight, Dale Ahlquist. Mr. Ahlquist earned his bachelor's degree from Carleton College and his master's degree from Hamline University. He is also a recipient of an honorary doctorate from Thomas More College of Liberal Arts. He's president of the Society for Gilbert Keith Chesterton, publisher of Gilbert magazine, and the creator and host of the popular EWTN series, The Apostle of Common Sense. Dale has written 5 books on Chesterton, including Common Sense 101, Lessons from G.K. Chesterton, and The Complete Thinker. He is also the co-founder of the Chesterton Academy, a classical high school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which has been rated one of the top 50 Catholic high schools in the nation, and is the chairman of the Chesterton Schools Network, which now includes 15 high schools in the U.S., Canada, and Italy. An internationally renowned speaker, Mr. Ahlquist has given more than 600 lectures at conferences, diocesan events, and institutions including Yale, Columbia, Cornell, Oxford, the Vatican Forum in Rome, the House of Lords in London. He's very well traveled, obviously. We're especially glad to welcome him back, however, to Our Ladies University this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dale Ahlquist.
Thank you, Carter, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be back here at Our Ladies College University, and I've just had a great time since I arrived here on Sunday morning. Spent a great deal of time over at the Special Collections, where I found just some great stuff over there. In the archives, as some of you may know, G.K. Chesterton himself visited Notre Dame in the fall of 1930. He was here for the opening of the football stadium, and of course that in itself is interesting, the whole juxtaposition of a man who'd never seen a football game in his life being introduced to a roaring crowd receiving him with this thunderous ovation. And he gave 18 lectures on Victorian literature and 18 lectures on Victorian history. And when President O'Donnell introduced his first talk, he said, "This is the greatest man we've ever had come and speak at Notre Dame." So it's pretty high praise. And it actually remains true to this day. He was the greatest man who's ever spoken at Notre Dame. So it's good to be able to carry on that tradition and talk about some of the things he said. And the fact that his lectures were about literature, I thought it would be important tonight to talk about literature and the way he gets at truth through the written word, through great works of literature. There's certainly been a decline in literary criticism, and it's gotten actually quite bad. And it's not just because literature has declined, but bad literary criticism has possibly contributed to the decline of literature. And Chesterton's role as a great literary critic is really overlooked. And it's possibly because he's so accomplished in other genres that's why his literary criticism is overlooked. But it's because he's so accomplished in all literary genres that all of his writing is overlooked. If he'd been less accomplished, he'd probably be more famous, more well-known. If he had written a finite amount of material, people could get a hold of him. But as it is, he seems too big to get a hold of. Now, what is the function of a literary critic? Chesterton says it would be a very defensible position to argue that the critic has no function whatsoever. Critics, he says, are much madder than poets. Homer is complete and calm enough. It's only his critics who have torn him into extravagant tatters. Shakespeare is quite himself. It's only some of his critics who have discovered that he's somebody else. And though St. John the Evangelist saw many strange monsters in his vision, he saw no creature so wild as one of his own commentators. He says the higher critics have an ability to discredit supernatural stories that have some foundation by telling natural stories that have no foundation. And he says the higher critics are wholly deficient in the highest form of criticism, which is self-criticism. But in spite of the fact that critics have made a very good case against themselves for having any existence whatsoever or any purpose, Chesterton does offer a defense on their behalf. He tells us what kind of critics we should have if we must have critics. So, a good critic should be like God, which is actually good advice for anybody, let alone critics. Architects should be like God, so should bricklayers. Bus drivers should be like God. And that's not an endorsement of megalomania. That is actually the sound advice that to be godlike means simply to be perfect. That's what Jesus said. Be perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect. So if we were all like that, well, we'd be good at whatever it was that we were doing. So that's the first advice for critics, is to be godlike, all right? Embody truth, goodness, beauty, love, mercy, holiness. But there's a particular reason why critics should be like God. And they should be like God in the sense that George MacDonald says, what George MacDonald describes God as easy to please and hard to satisfy. It's Chesterton quotes George MacDonald, God is easy to please and hard to satisfy. A critic should be able to look at a creative work and see what's good in it before seeing what's lacking in it. Modern critics are usually just the opposite. They're hard to please and easy to satisfy. I mean that they have a negative spirit, and that's their leading spirit. They start by tearing something apart, and then they seem content with that. They go after and ignore the simple pleasures that are common to all people. And when I say that they're easy to satisfy, I mean that they use catchwords in place of actual criticism. And they're satisfied with just the catchwords and not with an actual constructive analysis of a piece of work. They give into fashions, they give into imprecise ideas, and ultimately they're content with pretty thin stuff. So a critic should be like God, and I'm going to ask us to consider this idea a little more in depth. I'm going to go through a couple of godlike traits that the critic should have, and then I'm going to talk about two specific authors briefly and show you how Chesterton deals with those two authors. And then in the conclusion, I'm just going to very quickly talk about the authors that Chesterton talked about when he came here to Notre Dame in 1930. There's at least 5 ways that a critic should be like God, or 5 ways in which being like God would make for a good critic. First of all, to be like God is to be creative, as an artist is creative. God made us in his own image, which means he made us creators. That's one of the things that God gave us. He gave us his own creative ability. And the flip side of creation is appreciation. Creation is a gift that we've all been given, a gift that we did not deserve. The only way to respond to that gift is to be appreciative. Chesterton says thanks is the highest form of thought. We can't do anything with what we don't deserve other than to be thankful for it. So a critic should begin with appreciation. He should try to find the language of praise, which is the hardest language to find. But that's what creation itself did in response to God's creation. As Chesterton describes in the book of Job, when the trees clapped their hands for joy and the morning stars sang together over the glory and beauty of God's creation. Praise, he says, which was recognized in the Bible as the universal thing, is almost always right. It's always better criticism to admire a snake for having all the colors of the rainbow than to despise it for not having 2 legs. Critics would almost always be right if they would refrain from being critical. Okay, so now we're already in dangerous ground here. But let's move on to the second thing. The critic, what's the first thing that God created? First thing God created? Light. Catholics, and they've read the Bible. How about that? Yes, to be like God is to be a giver of light, to bring light into the darkness, to shed light on something that is confusing, is dark, to help people see what no one else sees, to help them see it. The critic has to be able to reveal the deeper meanings and things and to be able to convey that meaning. Art is just a thing of glimpses, and the critic has to try to capture one of those glimpses and preserve it. To preserve light like lightning, when lightning illuminates a landscape, to try to preserve that illumination. This image of light is wonderful in Chesterton. He says it in his book on Chaucer. There's at the back of existence an abyss of light. The actuality of being, a thing that we is too big for us to see. And then there's this wonderful passage from Heretics. I know you guys in Dr. Fagerberg's class just read Heretics, right? This great passage in the introduction where he says, suppose that a great commotion arises in the street about something, let us say a lamppost, which many influential persons desire to pull down. A gray-clad monk, who's the spirit of the Middle Ages, is approached upon the matter, and he begins to say, in the arid manner of the schoolmen, well, let us first of all, my brethren, consider the value of light. If light in itself be good, and at this point he is somewhat excusably knocked down. All the people make a rush for the lamppost is down in 10 minutes, and they go about congratulating each other on their unmedieval practicality. But as things go on, they don't work out so easily. Some people have pulled the lamppost down because they wanted electric light, some because they wanted old iron, some because they wanted darkness, because their deeds were evil. Some thought it not enough of a lamppost, some too much. Some acted because they wanted to smash municipal machinery, some because they wanted to smash something. And there's war in the night, no man knowing whom he strikes. So gradually and inevitably, today, tomorrow, or the next day, there comes back the conviction that the monk was right after all, and that all depends on what is the philosophy of light. only what we might have discussed under the gas lamp, we must discuss now in the dark. So, third of all, to be like God is to be true. Someone asked today at lunch, what's the purpose of literature? And Chesterton says the purpose of literature is to express the inexpressible, to find words where it doesn't seem to be words to describe something, deep calling to deep. And until, so what is the word trying to do? The word is trying to become flesh. That's what we do with literature. We're trying to get the word into flesh. And what the critic is really trying to do, and must do, is to contemplate the incarnational aspect of art. This is particularly challenging when the medium is just words. The words of the writer have become flesh, even though they still have to remain words. And so the incarnation is about the truth becoming real and becoming tangible. And that's what the critic has to do, is somehow make the truth tangible. And if it's not about truth, you have to see what's really there, and not see something that isn't there. Because if you're seeing something that isn't there, you're like the emperor's new clothes, pretending that there's something there, and only the smart people can see it, right? But there's really nothing on. So a critic has to be honest, and if he's a liar, he's really a promoter of lies. Chesterton says it's perfectly true that there's something in all good things that's beyond speech or figure of speech, but it's also true that there is in all good things a perpetual desire for expression and concrete embodiment. And though the attempt to embody it is always inadequate, the attempt is always made. If the idea does not seek to be the word, the chances are that it's an evil idea. If the word is not made flesh, it's a bad word. Thus, Giotto or Fra Angelico would have at once admitted theologically that God was too good to be painted, but they'd always try to paint him. And they felt very rightly that representing him as a rather quaint old man with a gold crown and a white beard, like a king of the elves, was less profane than resisting the sacred impulse to express him at all. That is why the Christian world is full of gaudy pictures, twisted statues that seem to many refined persons to be more blasphemous than the secret volumes of an atheist. But the trend of good is always towards incarnation. It's those refined thinkers who worship the devil, who always insist upon shapelessness and wordlessness and the unutterable character of the abomination. All right. Fourth, to be like God is to be sympathetic. The outsider cannot be truly sympathetic. To be truly sympathetic means to become an insider as God himself became an insider. In other words, to be like God is to be like Christ. To be purely objective is to remain an outsider and to never really know or understand or see or feel what's on the inside. Thus, the best critic is someone who's an artist himself. And the very best literary critic is a writer of something other than just criticism. Sympathy not only means weeping with those who weep, it means laughing with those who laugh, rejoicing with those who rejoice. And laughter is really something that we all long for, and criticism has lost its laughter. Art and literature have lost their laughter. The modern world has lost its laughter. It's lost its joy. And it is really quite dark and depressed. But the reason we've lost our laughter is because we've lost our morality. When we are no longer able to know right from wrong, when we no longer see our own incongruities, then we can't laugh, because we can't see that incongruity between what should be and how we sometimes fail to achieve that. Chesterton says a great deal of the new culture is not only cramped with affectations, but really under a bondage of vices. The sort of poetry that is said under a leering moon tends to obscurity rather than in the sense of secrecy. Some of these poets indeed can talk as plainly as they know how and still be obscure. Their style is sort of an impediment in the speech, a repetition that sounds like stammering. By the way, have anybody noticed that there's a new speech impediment that has affected about 98% of the population? There's this one word that keeps getting repeated about 8 or 9 times in every sentence. I've noticed the infection is here, even on the campus of Notre Dame. Like. We forbid the word at Chesterton Academy. I said, well, Dr. Rollins, what about if we use the word correctly? I said, you're not able to use it correctly. But even if you are able to use it correctly, find another word and show that you are in control of your ability to speak. If something is similar to another thing, say that it is similar to it. If it's something that you enjoy or prefer, say that you enjoy it or prefer it. But until you learn to use the word correctly, you can't use it at all. What we're thinking of doing is the little electric collar. The point here is that in bad literature, words tend to obscure rather than to illuminate. Sin is the color of smoke. It's not the color of fire. And smoke is not joyful, and it doesn't create anything, okay? The fifth point. You thought this was going to go slowly. I'm already on the last point. To be like God is to be a judge. Now, before we associate this with the last judgment and the unpleasant business of separating the sheep from the goats, we should associate being a judge with justice. Justice is something that we all long for. Fairness, it's actually present in the youngest child. The youngest child recognizes justice or perceived injustice right away. As soon as they can talk, that's not his, it's mine. He's had his turn, it's my turn. It's always my turn. But they understand justice right away and fairness right away. But justice is something that we long for, just like we long for laughter. Justice affirms, protects what is right, doesn't merely condemn what is wrong. However, it does have to occasionally condemn what is wrong. But the most important thing about a critic's judgment or justice is that the critic should reward righteousness. The judge should be a champion and a rescuer of the lowly and the downtrodden and the forgotten, and the one who restores them to their rightful place. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, these 5 points, I think, are useful in establishing the rules of literary criticism. And I think we see that none of them are pure and stand alone. They're all quite interconnected with each other. Because with Chesterton, everything is always connected to everything else, because every truth spills out into every other truth, or rather they're all connected to the great truth, which comes out in different ways. But before we actually turn to some of Chesterton's writings, I'd like to make the point that Chesterton himself is a great artist, but he's also a great critic. And his critics have failed to recognize his greatness. He very much is like George MacDonald's description of God, someone who's easy to please and hard to satisfy. He embraces all that's wonderful in creativity and artistry, but he doesn't praise the new simply because it's new. And he doesn't attack the old because it's not new. He explains why great art has endured and why great art, in fact, is always new, why permanent philosophies are permanent. He exhibits the virtue of self-control when it comes to new art and ideas that have rushed onto the scene. He doesn't get carried away by fashions and fads. He knows what's fleeting and what's eternal. He recognizes what's good in modern art and literature and philosophy and why it's good and why so often it's not. His description of modern books as piles of ingenuity and piles of futility is really quite succinct, because it shows that Chesterton is easy to please and hard to satisfy. He's pleased with the creativity and the cleverness, but he's not satisfied with the unending emptiness and fruitlessness of so much of our modern art, and nor should anyone be. And he also has been a great critic in analyzing the demise of art and literature, where other critics have failed. He says, in expressing confused ideas, the moderns have great subtlety and sympathy. It's in expressing clear ideas that they generally find their limitation. Perhaps the main reason for his success is that as a critic, he doesn't represent the artist, he represents the audience. In fact, in 1909, Chesterton was asked to testify before a parliamentary hearing on censorship. And he said he came there not as a member of the artistic community or as a writer, he came there as a member of the audience. He doesn't explain to the audience what the audience should feel. He explains what the audience does feel. And when you read his criticism, you realize, oh yeah, that's exactly right. He's putting your own reactions and your own feelings into words. And that's why he resonates as a critic, because he's a member of the audience with us. He's sympathetic with us. And he is our advocate. And that's one of the most Christ-like things about him. When he reveals the hidden meanings, when he explains the mystery, he does it like a good mystery writer. We recognize the truth instantly because we realize that we were staring at it all along. The modern poet, says Chesterton, has not performed the full literary function of translating living things into literature. He still needs an interpreter. And a crowd of interpreters has officiously rushed between the poet and the public. But it does a certain amount of harm, I think, intercepting the true process of perfecting human expression. It's not wrong because it encourages a great man to talk. It's wrong because it actually encourages the great man from talking plainly. The priests and the priestesses of the temple take a pride in the oracle remaining oracular. The vast but vague revolution that we call the modern world largely began about the time that men demanded that Scripture should be translated into English. It ended in a time when nobody dares to demand that English poets should be translated into English. If we compare, let us say, the morality of the Divine Comedy with the morality of Henrik Ibsen's Ghosts, we shall see that modern ethics, we shall see what modern ethics have done. Dante describes three moral instruments: heaven, purgatory, and hell. Not in that order. But the vision of perfection, the vision of improvement, and the vision of failure. Ibsen describes only one: hell. Modern realists are indeed terrorists, like the dynamiters, and they fail just as much in their effort to create a thrill. Both realists and terrorists are well-meaning people engaged in the ultimately hopeless task of using science to promote morality. I'll just let that one hang in the air for a minute. Who would compare a realist with a terrorist except G.K. Chesterton? And how does he do it? Using science to promote morality. You can't force people through material means to change their mind. You can only hurt them. That's what torture is. Okay, so let's look at two. Torture is also the talk I'm giving right now. Let's look at two writers that Chesterton is a great admirer of, and he wrote some wonderful criticism of. And one is Charles Dickens, and the other is Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, most of you have heard of them. With Charles Dickens, let's say everybody at least knows about A Christmas Carol, okay? And with Robert Louis Stevenson, let's say that everybody at least knows about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So as a bare minimum, there are two authors that we know them for two works that have at least made it to the movies, okay? Best film adaptation of Christmas Carol? Albert Finney's Scrooge, that's right. That's because when the ghost of Christmas Present comes in, and Albert Finney says, "Who are you?" And it's Dame Edith Evans, and she says, "I am the spirit whose coming was foretold." And he says, "You don't look like a ghost." And she says, "Thank you." All right, so Chesterton was once asked the typical question, what book would you want to have with you on a desert island? And his answer was Thomas's Guide to Practical Shipbuilding, right? He says most people, when they are asked that question, they usually answer Shakespeare or the Bible, because that would be the first time they've ever read those books, right? But when push came to shove, the real answer he gave was the book he'd want to have with him on the desert island was Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. In his 1906 book on Dickens, he devotes a whole chapter to Pickwick. He explains why that piece of literature is eternal and why eternal is a good thing and not a bad thing. Pickwick himself is the Ulysses of comedy, and his story is an epic about living happily ever after, pausing to appreciate some of the uproarious incidents that happen along the way. Popular religion, says Chesterton, has endless joys and endless jokes, but we have lost both. We are too weak to desire that undying vigor. We believe that you can have too much of a good thing, a blasphemous belief, which at one blow wrecks all the heavens that men have hoped for. Now that's what literary criticism is meant to be. It's not this behind-the-scenes tour showing how the tricks were done. It's not an inspection of the surface crack and the structural flaws. No, it's this privileged journey deep inside where we get to see things that we might have missed if we didn't have the guide with us, or if we'd ventured all alone. But the things that were always there. Chesterton really does play Virgil to our exploration into to other works of literature. He's Virgil to our Dante, guides us with a sure hand into the world of Dickens. And he justly warns us at the beginning, pointing at the sign above the gate into the world of Dickens, "Abandon all hopelessness, you who enter here." Because Dickens is about hope, the great virtue, the most neglected of the virtues. The virtue that Chesterton said when he was received into the Catholic Church and was reading the Penny Catechism on the day that he became Catholic. He said there was one line that jumped out of the catechism that epitomized everything he was trying to accomplish as a writer. It said that the two sins against hope are presumption and despair. And too much of the modern world either falls into presumption or into despair. But Dickens has that great virtue of hope. And he says that at one day, he says, we'll meet the great Dickens characters. He says this about Dickens. He says, the public doesn't like bad literature. The public likes a certain kind of literature, but it likes that kind of literature even when it's bad, better than another type of literature even when it's good. And that's not unreasonable. The line between the different types of literature is as real as the line between tears and laughter. And to tell people that they can only get bad comedy when you have some really first-rate tragedy for them is irrational. And it's the same as offering a man who's shivering over weak, cold coffee by offering him some really superior ice. Ordinary people dislike the delicate modern work not because it's good, but because it's bad. It's simply not the thing that they asked for. And Chesterton defends the ordinary man. He defends the common man. And he says, commonness and the common mind are now generally spoken of as meaning in some manner inferiority in the inferior mind, the mind of the mere mob. But the common mind means the mind of all the artists and all the heroes, or else it would not be common. Plato had the common mind. Dante had the common mind. Commonness means the quality common to the saint and to the sinner, the philosopher and the fool, and it's this thing that Dickens grasped and developed, and in everybody there's a certain thing that loves babies, that fears death, that likes sunlight, and that thing also enjoys Dickens. And he says, when I say that everybody understands Dickens, I do not mean he's suited to the untaught intelligence. I mean he is so plain that even scholars understand him. And here's the wonderful passage with which Chesterton ends his book on Dickens. Comradeship and serious joy are not interludes in our travel, but rather our travels are interludes in comradeship and joy, which, through God, shall endure forever. The inn does not point to the road points to the inn. And all roads point at last to an ultimate inn, where we shall meet Dickens and all his characters, when we shall drink again, and it shall be from the great flagons in the tavern at the end of the world. Okay, Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson also gets at something common in the common man. But Chesterton's literary criticism of Stevenson is so interesting because he talks about books that you've never read and you never will read. But he makes you want to read them. When you read his criticism, you think, I might read that book someday. But you know you're not going to. But he still gives you, he still is teaching you something about a book that you haven't even read by taking a point from it and bringing it home. And he's really quite exquisite with that. And then he'll point out the things that you don't know about things you don't know, but he'll also point out the thing that you've been staring at that you think you understand, that you've been understanding completely wrong because you just think you understand Jekyll and Hyde, right? Everybody thinks, well, it's good and bad. You separate, one guy's all good, the other guy's all bad, right? And you know, he separated the two, right? That's what it's about, right? Chesterton says, the real stab of the story is not in the discovery that one man is two men, but in the discovery that the two men are one man. After all the diverse wandering and warring of these two incompatible beings, there is still only one man born and only one man buried. Jekyll and Hyde have become a proverb and a joke, only it's a proverb read backwards and a joke that nobody sees. The point of the story is not that a man can cut himself off from his conscience, but that he cannot. The reason is that there can never be equality between the evil and the good. Jekyll and Hyde are not twin brothers. They are rather, as one of them truly remarks, like father and son. It was Jekyll that created Hyde, and Hyde would never have created Jekyll he could only destroy Jekyll. As St. Thomas Aquinas points out, only heaven can create and hell can only destroy. And here's another passage I want to read from his book on Robert Louis Stevenson, because you wish that Chesterton had written a book on Edgar Allan Poe. But the point is, in his book on Stevenson, he sums up Edgar Allan Poe in one paragraph. Instead of writing a whole book, he just writes one paragraph and nails it. Listen to this. Dark wine, dying lamps, drugging odors, a sense of being stifled in curtains of black velvet, a substance which is at once utterly black and unfathomably soft, all carried with them in a sense of indefinite and infinite decay. The point of Poe is that we feel that everything is decaying, including ourselves. Faces are already growing featureless like those of lepers. Roof trees are rotting from root to root, root to roof. One great gray fungus, as vast as a forest, is sucking up life rather than giving it forth. Mirrored in stagnant pools like lakes of poison, which yet fade without line or frontier into the swamp. The stars are not clean in his sight, but rather more worlds made for worms. And this corruption is increased by an intense imaginative genius with the addition of a satin surface of luxury and even a terrible sort of comfort. This dark luxury has something almost liquid about it. Its laxity seems to be betraying more vividly how all these things are being sucked away from us down a slow whirlpool, more like a moving swamp. That is the atmosphere of Edgar Allan Poe, a sort of rich rottenness of decomposition with something thick and narcotic in the very air. Is that prose that is poetic or what? Chesterton says it's always better to write poetic prose than prosaic poetry. The purpose of good prose is to make words mean what they say, and the purpose, he says, of good poetry is to make words mean what they don't say. But there he gets Poe in one paragraph. In the same book, he sums up Henry James in one sentence, one short sentence. He says, "No lady in Henry James ever skipped." Henry James, done. All right. In speaking of short sentences summing up writers, I'm going to quote a few things that Chesterton said here on this campus that were never written other than in some students' notes. There were no transcripts of the talks. The only record we have of the talks are some students' notes that are in the archives over there at the library. First, one historical figure, Mary Queen of Scots, he says, she was executed for being in good health. So on some writers, on Thomas Carlyle, his beliefs were all make-beliefs. On Edward Bulwer Lytton, who knows who Edward Bulwer Lytton is? What do you know? Tell us what you know about him.
Well, he was a literary figure in the Victorian period.
Yeah. That was clear enough because Chesterton's, all his lectures were on literary figures from the Victorian period, yeah. So that I'm going to grant that. She's right. Do you know anything? Can you name any of the books he wrote?
No.
Yeah. But she knew he was a literary figure from the Victorian period. What? Name of a book? Anybody know what his most famous line was? It was a dark and stormy night. And that's his contribution to English literature, right there. Chesterton says he was quite successfully modern, which is the reason why he's almost completely forgotten. On George Eliot, she was not a hilarious person. On Thackeray, his greatest cynicism is on cynicism. On Matthew Arnold, he was fanatical against fanaticism. On Robert Browning, he could pass quickly from the ridiculous to the sublime without seeming ridiculous. On Oscar Wilde, he worshiped beauty to the neglect of truth and morality. As a result, poetry became artificial. And then on his great friends George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, he says they tried to fulfill Victorian ideals which were never meant to be fulfilled. He says the weakness of Victorian literature is that it never went anywhere. There were ideas and images thrown out, but no one took any of their ideas to their logical conclusion, with the exception of one Victorian writer who took his ideas to their logical conclusion, and it brought him to the Catholic Church. And that fellow was just canonized on Sunday. Newman. Chesterton says what the Victorian writers did was they weakened Protestantism. And as a result, it put the Catholic Church in a stronger position, epitomized by Cardinal Newman. And so Chesterton's concluding line for you this evening is, anything beautiful always means more than it says. And I want to thank you for your kind attention. Thank you. Take a look at the question. Sure.
Friends, we have about 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll have a reception where we can continue our conversation. But Maggie has the microphone. If you'd like to say something, indicate that to her. She'll bring you the microphone, and then we'll be able to capture your question on the film as well.
And since we're, while you're thinking of that first question, since we are on TV, I'll start with a commercial. I did bring a few books for sale here, and we also would encourage you to join the Chesterton Society. If you do join, we'll send you 2 free books of Chesterton's essays, which are worth the value of joining. So, plus you get Gilbert magazine, the greatest magazine in the world. So I would encourage you to come see me afterwards and give me money. So, questions?
You knew this question was coming. So, thoughts on the on Chesterton's cause for canonization being closed?
It hasn't been closed. It just hasn't been opened. That's different. That's a different concept altogether. The Bishop of Northampton has announced that he was not going to proceed with the cause, but he also told me he doesn't want to stand in the way of it. He'll do nothing to impede it. It's amazing how the press reports it badly. But Chesterton would not be surprised, because he says the art of journalism is the art of missing the point. And so the process is that a bishop has to open the cause, and this bishop says he's not going to. He's just also given his retirement, so he probably, he'll have a replacement within a year, and maybe that will be the bishop, but it could be a bishop from a different diocese who's more prone to seeing Chesterton's cause going forward, and who actually knows something about Chesterton too, because that, I think, would help. I don't know if you ever heard that fellow who said that the prophet is without honor in his own country. That's really the case with G.K. Chesterton. He's got a great following all over the world and a great devotion, and I also have some prayer cards that I'll give to everybody who wants one too. So it was a disappointment, but not a discouragement, and we're going to just keep proceeding with it. There are people who want to see it go forward, because we need more literary critics who are saints, especially if they smoke cigars.
How would Chesterton say joy and laughter can be restored to academia and to the church, or saddened church these days?
Well, I think if we canonize some joyful saints, that might help. It's another reason we need someone like Chesterton as an example of what lay spirituality is, but also what Catholic joy looks like, what it looks like. In his book on Chaucer, here's an example of literary criticism pointing to what we need. He says, in Chaucer's time, there was corruption, and there were a lot of bad things happening. And he says, in times of corruption, good men become very serious and very worried. But great men will resist becoming too serious and too worried, because God is in control. All the truths are still there, that existence is this gift that we don't deserve, and the incarnation is the greatest reason for joy and hope, and that never changes no matter what's going on. The church is always in crisis, and the world is always in crisis, and the great saint comes along, and as Fulton Sheen, who's going to be joining the saints very soon, says, saints are not sad. And so we look to the saints to help make us happy. And I think that's why we need Chesterton more than ever right now. Yes, right here. Well, back there than him.
Great talk. For someone who's never read anything from Chesterton, where do you recommend someone might start?
Well, you should probably read one of my introductory books to G.K. Chesterton. Because that's what they were designed to do for that person who's never read any Chesterton. I mean, picking up a pure Chesterton book is always encouraged, but it can be intimidating because he doesn't write like anybody else. And you have to throw yourself at his mercy and let him lead you. Let him read you. And that's the great paradox. Let Chesterton read you. But my books are designed to make it easygoing for that, to get you through the door. And I have a couple of them here. Apostle of Common Sense. I don't think I have any copies of Common Sense 101 left, but I can send you one free postage. But those are the two introductory books, Common Sense 101 and The Apostle of Common Sense. But any book of his essays is a good introduction. The Father Brown stories are good too. At some point you have to read Orthodoxy, and then you have to read it 2 more times. Right here is a question to Maggie too.
It seems to me a wonderful time to mention a few of the other Chesterton things going on here. The course that Dr. Fagerberg gives, the seminar that Dean Kremers has, the Stanley Yaki book. Do you know that book?
Yes, Chesterton's Seer of Science, yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, well, let's
May know about
let's
those
mention those
things.
things. First of all, Martin Kremers has just become the advisor of the Chesterton Student Club that is just getting started. And where are you, Teresa? There you are. She's one of the leaders of the new group. And when are you going to start meeting?
As soon as SAO approves us.
So we're that close. November or December. But also, Martin Kremers hosts a weekly, was it monthly discussion at his home, and you just read Chesterton. You don't have to do any reading ahead of time. You just come and the group reads from a Chesterton book together. Right now they're working their way through the Thomas Aquinas book. That's a great way to read Chesterton with others. And that's a monthly meeting. But the big news from Notre Dame, other than the fact that you once gave Chesterton an honorary doctorate, and you have a great Chesterton collection here, is that Notre Dame has acquired one of the major Chesterton collections in the world in England, and it's going to be part of the London Gateway campus over there, right across from Trafalgar Square, and they're going to set up a permanent home for it there. It's going to make this a wonderful, accessible collection, and it really help Chesterton in his homeland by making this this great research tool available, and tighten the connection between Notre Dame and Chesterton as well. Yes, here's a question here from Brady.
What would you say is the current status of academic scholarship on Chesterton, and how have you seen that change in the past few decades?
Yeah, 2 decades ago, there was almost zero academic scholarship on Chesterton. And since that time, there has been almost a renaissance, a blooming of undergraduate theses on Chesterton, graduate dissertations on Chesterton at the master's and at the doctoral level. And it is all coming from the ground up. That's the best thing to know about. I mean, Dr. Fagerberg teaches his Chesterton course here, and it's truly one of the best Chesterton courses in the nation because you've got a great Chesterton scholar teaching it. And that has created a ripple effect so that students who take that class will want to continue their studies of Chesterton. But there's a program at Baylor University. Dr. Ralph Woods has been an advisor for multiple students doing their doctoral dissertations on Chesterton because he's a scholar as well. But some of them are finding that they have to kind of educate their own advisor about Chesterton, and if the advisor himself is willing, to learn about Chesterton, they can still help them and guide them through their dissertation process. When I did my master's thesis, my advisor didn't know anything about Chesterton at all. I told him about it, and it worked out really well together.
Friends, that's all the time we have for questions, but we can join us for the reception. We can continue our conversation. Join me again thanking our wonderful speaker.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Great pleasure. Thank you.